What happens?
Good afternoon. This is Martha DiVittorio, local history librarian at the Bellmore Memorial Library, and with me is
Regina Feeney, librarian and archivist at the Freeport Memorial Library.
Today we're going to tell you about resources available at your public library for residential genealogy, which I think is a term we coined this afternoon.
So first we want to just mention that we are practicing social distancing.
Yes.
In my zombie apocalypse bunker in Freeport, otherwise known as the basement. And Martha, I hear you're on David Geffen's yacht.
I am indeed, and it is wonderful out here. Thank goodness I was stuck here. So
yes, it's good to have friends. All right, so anyway, we're going to do a little presentation today on how to do some research on your house. And of course, we're going to also talk about some questions that we've gotten in the past about this. If I could get my computer to advance. Okay, let's talk about some important dates. And these are things you need to know when you're learning about your house and your community. One of the questions I get all the time is, I live in Freeport, and why am I not in the Freeport School District? There's part of Freeport that's in the Roosevelt School District and part of Freeport that's in the Baldwin School District. And that has to do with the fact that the school districts here were established around 1812. Freeport probably came online about 1820. So Freeport doesn't become Freeport until the 1830s, and we're not incorporated until the 1890s. So basically, Freeport is, the school districts predate the towns. And so the boundaries have expanded throughout the years. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, if you live in Bellmore, things are really crazy. You know now that there are 4 separate, Bellmore, North Bellmore, Merrick, North Merrick. Now you have the Bellmore Merrick Central High School District. So that's all crazy, and zoning is nuts. But initially, before the first high school was built in Bellmore, which I believe was 1935, Bellmore residents, teens, had a choice. You had to choose between Freeport and Hempstead to go to high school. So things are not always straightforward, or they're certainly not the way they are today.
Another important date is when the railroad comes to the South Shore. Originally, the first railroad that came out to this area is around 1839, and that was in the village of Hempstead. So once that comes through, people in Freeport and Bellmore and along the South Shore, they had to take a stagecoach to Hempstead to get on that train. It's not going to be until 1867 when the South Side Railroad comes our way. And this is a real game changer for us, because these communities here on the South Shore are quite isolated. And the railroad starts bringing in new people, and we start to begin the development of these communities as resorts. Right. And is that the same for you in Bellmore?
Absolutely. This was where you went to catch a little bit of country air, maybe shoot some game. It was not a place you thought of living. Farms, fishing, but yeah, you're absolutely right.
Right. And I always like to say Freeport was the Hamptons before the Hamptons. And yes. And this is where people did come. And that changes even later on, when around 1910 is when the tunnel is actually open between Manhattan and Long Island. So that brings even more people out. But another important date is the establishment of Greenfield Cemetery in 1870. And this is an important date because before then, you had different types of cemeteries. So you had association cemeteries, you had church cemeteries, and sometimes you just got buried on your own property.
Right, you had a family plot.
Exactly. And the problem with that is, especially things like association cemeteries, where you were responsible for taking care of your own grave, which becomes really difficult once you're dead. So a lot of these cemeteries became unsightly. They became eyesores, and there was a lot of vandalism. And so once Greenfield is established, a lot of families began to disinter and remove their relatives to Greenfield. And then what then happens is those that are left, these cemeteries become, they're actually condemned. And this is not something where they just move bodies willy-nilly. This actually had to go through up to the state government, and the governor would have to sign off on these disinterments. And if you go to Greenfield today, you are going to see tombstones from the 1700s. And it wasn't just they were very lucky to get buried there in this area that became a cemetery. They were moved. And a lot of that moving was done by Stewart of Garden City. As he started to lay out streets and develop Garden City and different areas, they had all these cemeteries, and they were condemned and then eventually moved.
And if you want to see an example of a family plot, you can always go to the Baldwin Southern Cemetery in Bellmore, which tends to look like an eyesore, and it's unclear as to who is responsible for its upkeep. But we did have a dedicated group of Eagle Scouts years back who cleaned it up and discovered the oldest grave and sort of publicized, and people do sometimes go and walk through there and sit there, but it is not very nice. So I think, Regina, your point is well taken.
Right. And just so you know, in the Freeport Cemetery that we had, we do have the disinterment records for part of that cemetery. And all the bodies were removed. Though I did read an article when they started putting the sewer lines in and the water lines in, they did find a couple of bones, but otherwise I haven't heard anything else about.
No poltergeist scenario?
No, yeah, exactly. No poltergeist. 1899 is when Nassau County gets established. So before then, we were part of Queens County, which is good to know because a lot of our records are not necessarily going to be in Nassau County. So if you're looking at census records, you will see your town and you'll see, Queens County. Just remember, Nassau County is a newer county. The other thing, another important date here is 1911. And this is the village of Hempstead starts to install sewers. And you're thinking like, well, why is that important? Well, I often get questions from people whose backyards have a sinkhole. And that's because these are the old cesspools that are collapsing. And actually in my backyard, I do have a divot, and I do believe that's probably an old cesspool. But people need to understand that this infrastructure, I know in Freeport started around 1920s into the 1930s. When we started putting these sewer lines in. And this was a really, really big deal when this happened. And just so you know, when we start to do streets, and you might have a street that it's like horrible, it's like the surface of the moon. In Freeport, they don't just come in and they just repave it. They actually dig all it up and change all those pipes. And the reason for that is because those pipes are 100 years old. So they do need to be changed out. 1925 is the formation of the Nassau County Police Department. So in Freeport, we had our own Freeport Police. I think in Bellmore, you were probably under the sheriff of Nassau County.
Probably, I believe so.
Mm-hmm. And so this was an issue, and it's not. I don't think it's a coincidence that this police department is formed in the middle of Prohibition, because at that time, any of us living on the South Shore, these were the biggest places where alcohol was being brought in and brought to the city. So those local police forces could not handle this. So Nassau County gets formed formed in 1925. Now,
and in both Freeport and Bellmore, there are homes with tunnels where rum runners would bring in alcohol. So it's kind of a cool but unspoken part of our shared history.
Mm-hmm. And it's funny because a lot of people never wanted to talk about it. They didn't want to admit the fact that their family was doing this stuff. I mean, now everyone thinks it's really cool. But let me just say this: there's a lot of money in vice, and people made a lot of money bringing booze in. 1928 is when the first stretch of Sunrise Highway is developed. And this is an important date because a lot of people, when they look at our older maps, get really confused because we know Sunrise Highway is a point of reference and it doesn't exist.
Right.
And, and you have something in Bellmore about the opening of Sunrise Highway, right?
We do, actually. We have the grand opening of Sunrise Highway. There was a parade. And apparently the Merrymakers of Bellmore, which was a club that got together for lots of fun times, won a silver cup for the best decorated float. And we have this beautiful ornate silver cup. So when our doors open, you can come in, you can make an appointment and come and see it. But we also, we wanted to mention also about the names is that you will see on old maps, you'll see Pipeline Boulevard, you'll see Conduit, actually Conduit Boulevard in Queens is still called Conduit because it was a conduit for the water. And it's still called Conduit Boulevard in Queens. So Sunrise Highway was different names all across.
Right.
And finally, they named it Sunrise Highway. And this was a big push towards the development of Long Island as a bedroom community for folks who worked in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And what happened is when they developed Sunrise Highway, they basically overtook all of these little tiny roads, and then they basically followed the route of the pipes that were part of the Brooklyn Waterworks system. So, you know, Sunrise Highway isn't straight. You'll notice that there's lots of curves in it, and that's because they're following the pipes. And if you go under Sunrise Highway, there are these huge water pipes under there. And those pipes were used as emergency backup water to Brooklyn until about 1977. So they are still there. All right. Okay, so what do we talk about some typical questions we get from our patrons?
Right. I mean, I think first of all, the most common one is, I've just moved and my house is old. So I think it might be historically significant, and 9 times out of 10, I'm so sorry, but it's not. There's nothing
that a lot.
Right. It's not landmarkable. You know, everybody immediately thinks, and the other thing is also, and I believe it's haunted. I get that. We get that question all the time. I'm not joking. So they want to begin to research the house, who lived in it,
who died in it.
Who died in it, more importantly, exactly.
Am I on a burial site? You know. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you had mentioned earlier, right, about the sinkhole.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yeah. People. Weird things happen. They're like, what's going on? And or why did my basement flood? And we'll talk about that in a minute. But I can actually, I think 90% of the questions I get about houses are people think that their house is haunted. Yeah. And I can sort of relate to that because I grew up in a house that had an issue, and our little ghost was really into like moving furniture, which was nice, but not very helpful. I mean, you know, if you want to be helpful, like, you know, fold the laundry, you know, that, right? I mean, that's what I would do. If I was a ghost stuck in a house, I would clean for you. I'd make your bed. Aww. You know, I want to be a good ghost. So there's another thing that we talk about is like what structures might have existed on the property. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but there's sometimes people are like questioning, you know, what was on this property. I know in Freeport, people have dug up their backyards to put pools in, and they found trolley tracks that the trolleys used to run behind the houses. And I think you also mentioned the urban legends, and I get that all the time. I get like, everyone thinks that Mae West lived in their house, and Mae West never heard of Freeport.
Well, that's exactly, I mean, you know, when you hear people talk about past lives, like everybody was a Napoleon or Cleopatra, you know, you might just have been a street sweeper. So that's the same thing with the houses. You know, your house may be beautiful and it may be built in a particular style, but we may not be able to find something historically significant. But it's still your beautiful home.
It's worth a try. It's
absolutely.
Worth a try. And you know what? You can make it historically significant someday.
Hey, there you go.
There you go. All right. So okay. So this is some other things that people ask us, and believe it or not, we do get questions from geologists. I don't know, Martha, if you've gotten that. But
I really don't. I think this is much more your library. I'm sorry. I will correct myself. We have somebody who is doing a fish migration study with the Bellmore Civic Association, and they have been pouring through our old maps, and they have found they're enormously useful. So I take that back, and that's a recent development. But typically, I think these questions do go to you.
Right, and that's usually when somebody wants to do a new build on a property, and I have an example of that. But back in the 1970s, a homeowner was doing some work on their property, and they kept finding all these like old bottles and stuff. And they were able to find out that on their property was an old garbage dump. And this is very interesting. Before you had municipal sanitation, people would burn their garbage and they'd bury it. And the gentleman actually found something like 470 glass bottles, which I think collectors love that stuff. So,
They do.
you know, so you never know. You'll never know. And that this one particular patron, one of the bottles dated back as far as 1874. And so you'll never know what's on your property until you start digging, literally.
Don't tell your kids.
Okay. Okay. So this presentation came about a few years ago. I was approached by the Nassau County Bar Association, their real estate division, because there had been an article in Newsday about this home. The house is called Woodbine, and the reporter wanted me to do some research on it, and it finally got published, and the Nassau County Bar Association wanted me to talk about this one particular research project. And I was kind of like, yeah, I think it's not enough there to do a presentation. So I called out to Martha and I was like, hey, Martha, you want to put something together and highlight some of the research that we have in our own libraries that could help these attorneys when they're doing property searches. And so we got together and we did it. So we kind of retooled this program to bring it out to a general audience.
Right.
But this particular house was John J. Randall's house. And John J. Randall was the father of Freeport. He was born in 1847 and he was president of the Freeport Bank. And he was one of the early developers in Freeport. And he's known as the father of Freeport. He's the guy that financed the construction of Woodcliff Canal. And he was very, very prominent in real estate development here on Long Island and in Brooklyn. And this was his home. It was a high Victorian home. And the story was, and this is how this was being reported, or was going to be reported in Newsday, that the house got split. The house was split, but because of a divorce. And that is sort of that urban legend, that John J. Randall got a divorce from his wife and they split the house down the middle. And even the current owner, who is pictured here on the left, her name is Marilyn Monroe. And she believed, she had heard this. Well, that's not true. It's really not true.
Excellent story, though, I have to say.
It's a great story, but we can prove that it's not true. So Marilyn Monroe's house is gorgeous. And I have the URL at the bottom of the page. You should go to the site. They have like the inside shots of the house. She is a collector of African and Afrocentric art. And you would think, how does that work in a high Victorian? It works. It is so beautiful. And actually in the top floor of the house, she has this gorgeous meditation studio. So definitely check that out. But I was able to prove that John J. Randall never got a divorce, because there is no record of him getting a divorce. And if you go to the cemetery, now, as an archivist, I consider tombstones that were erected at the time of someone's death a primary document. So here we are at the Randall Miller plot in Greenfield Cemetery, and all three of John J. Randall's wives are buried in the plot with him. So definitely not a divorce. His first two wives predeceased him, and his third wife, who was also his housekeeper, died after him. So we can actually cross that off as an urban legend. The second question that I got from the reporter is, when did the house actually get split? And so this is where we had to sort of dig into our resources for maps. And we knew from having spoken to John J. Randall III many years ago that the house he believes got split about 1920. And again, we don't like to always go by people's memories. We really want something hard facts. And here we have two maps. And one map is the house and it's all of its property in 1917. And then here's another map from 1925, and the house is split. So John J. Randall III was right. It happened sometime around 1920. And you're probably thinking, well, why did he split the house? And it's believed that the house was so big that John J. Randall I didn't want the house to ever become a rooming house. And he was afraid that could happen because the area of Freeport was getting developed. And the house was just too big for anyone to really care for it properly. So the house got split, and part of the house got moved to West Woodbine, and the other half got moved to East Woodbine. And this house is actually in a development, which is very confusing for people today. It's called Randall Park. And I'm sure you have this in Bellmore too. These residential developments were often called parks. And they're not parks with playgrounds. You know, they're parks of development. And but today in Freeport, people know Randall Park as a southern park, which is if you ever go down to Woodcliff Canal, you're going to pass it. It's between Guy Lombardo and South Ocean Avenue, and that there to the right you can see a picture of the gates going into Randall Park. And this was property that John J. Randall willed to the Village of Freeport upon his death, and it is a park. So
when they spoke about park, they really meant like a zone or an area, like a historic development zone. So
exactly. And I know, do you have a lot of are you familiar with all the developments in Bellmore? Do you are familiar with their names? Yeah.
I know that there was White City, which was back in the 1940s, which sounds terrible, but it was actually developed by a developer whose last name was White. Mm-hmm. There was, I think, Bellmore. I think there's a Bellmore Park, and no one uses either one of those names anymore. Like they're really not relevant anymore.
Well, they can be if you are looking at like in the legal notices in newspapers. Sometimes those will pop up, and you're like, wait, what are you talking about? And people see that and they're talking about Randall Park, and they think, oh, they must be talking about the South Freeport. And I'm like, no, they're talking about North Freeport. So yeah.
So if you want to delve into research, here are the different types of resources that are available at various Nassau County libraries. You have local history collections, which they're kind of hit and miss. Some are more robust than others. My local history collection is a teeny tiny fraction of what Regina has. But definitely there are items of value, and there are definitely items, and I don't mean monetary value, I meant information. And there are items there that will put you on the right track and point you in the right direction to finding your answer. There are vertical files. This is an old library term, which is basically drawers, like old filing drawers filled with clippings, which we'll talk about in a minute. There is Ancestry.com, which I think all of Nassau County libraries subscribe to, but it is only for use at the library, except this is the pandemic edition of our presentation. So for the moment, Ancestry.com has opened up its use so that people can use it from home. And I believe they've extended that through June 30th. Is that correct?
They did. And you can't just go to Ancestry.com. You do have to go through your library's webpage, because it will ask for the barcode of your library card to access.
Right. So, right. If there ever were a time to promote getting a library card, and I think we're going to do that a couple of times, but it really is your passport to everything. So if you go in through your library's website, and there will be a new link, not just, hey, you can only use this in-house. There's going to be, it's like a temporary home subscription. So you do have to go in with your library card. Then there are newspaper databases. So your libraries will all have historic New York Times from 1851 to the present, and also Newsday, which started in 1940 and obviously continues to the present. There are also directories and phone books, which can be enormously useful when you're trying to, for example, figure out then and now. In 1967, what did the main strip look like in my town? So you can actually go through. You can use the yellow pages, the white pages, and just a special note, Great Neck has a collection for Nassau County, New York telephone books. They have the white pages, I think, they have 1913, and then 1915 to 1976 on microfilm, and 77 to 2004 on microfiche, which is easier to use. And they're in geographical arrangement. So the last available year they have is 2004. But these are really, really helpful for family, doing research on a family, how long they lived in a town, how many of them were in a particular area. And again, for businesses, that's where I really use the directories. And last is environmental impact studies, which Regina, you've had occasion.
Right. Yeah. So like we've had a couple of places that like Columbia Bronze, and there was a Nassau Uniform, and there's a couple of places that had some issues that had a lot of chemicals. So they had to do cleanups, and and a lot of times other locations such as dry cleaners, they've had to look at sort of cleaning up that soil. So those records are all given to you, to our library, and we have them, so you can check them out. Just one thing, getting back to some of the directories, some of those directories are now available on Ancestry. They're a little kind of hard to use, but you can find them. But one of the older directories are so cool because they also do a street by street. So you can go to a street and it'll tell you everyone who lived on that street. So that it's really kind of a really cool thing.
So here is what I was talking about. This is a typical, clipping or vertical file. And actually this, the Historical Society of the Bellmores created, it was like a little photo album, which is very cute, buildings and places. But sadly, a lot of hometown newspapers are not digitized by their publisher, and they're not archived. It's often up to the local library to keep a full run of these papers and hopefully invest in the future in a costly and time-consuming digitization effort. We just did it. I would say now it's been 2 years. We just got our hometown newspaper digitized, and at our expense, and it took a very, very long time, and the community is loving it. Till you can afford or have the time to do the digitization, clippings can be of tremendous value. So that's an example. 75th anniversary for the Worth House. Our hometown paper had a feature for many, many years where they would look back, 100 years ago in Bellmore, and it was really wonderful, and the community loved it. So before it was digitized, this was the way we would have clippings, in this way that we provided information.
Yeah, I still have all our old vertical files, and I'm just looking at your 75th anniversary image there, and the one crazy thing about a lot of our vertical files, there's all these undated articles, and you're like, you have no idea when this was, start doing the math there, what was 75th anniversary for the Worth House. But yeah, that's one of the problems. And the other problems is, so a lot of people, and we tried to fix this, they put the actual cutout newspaper into the vertical file, and over time those articles start to to become embrittled and actually turn to dust. So there are some issues with vertical files, but I concur. It's because it's sometimes in our verticals, they're more than just newspaper articles. They might have been like a brochure to something too.
Right? No, absolutely. We have, definitely. And this, I happen to know that the Worth House was established in 1903, so I know this paper is from 1978.
Oh, but good. You can do math, because I wouldn't be able to do that. So that on you.
I haven't had my wine yet. But you'll often see a very diligent, dedicated, either local history society, historical society member, or librarian, very neatly write the date of the newspaper on the. So there's a lot of love and care that goes into typical vertical files.
And I believe the Queens Public Library, they have their big Long Island division. They do maintain vertical files on all the towns. So they're still actively clipping. And I think Hofstra has, I don't think they might not be actively clipping, but they do maintain vertical files.
Yep, they do. Okay, so before we were talking about, why do you need to know about your property? And I think that knowing the history of a property makes it more marketable, right? It's if you can say something interesting or fascinating about, that's the original wall from the fireplace of this house that was built in 1782, that's attractive. This particular property in town, it's like an orphan, and it breaks my heart. So I kind of wanted to talk about it. Can the illustrious history of this little piece of land save this patch of real estate? This sad, empty little triangle, I don't know if you can see the signs. One says Bellmore Road and the other one says Bellmore Avenue. So to the left is Bellmore Avenue, to the right is Bellmore Road, and this is a little triangle of land in between. And it was known as Deubert's Corner for the longest time. It has quite a history, but it has remained vacant and really kind of bleak looking since a fire set by arsonists destroyed the last restaurant to do business at the historic site. First, it was handled by A.J. Finkelstein Real Estate. Then it was Greystone Properties, and most recently, most recently Greystone Properties. But new setback laws, meaning how far from the street you have to have your property. New setback laws are making this triangle-shaped property really difficult to sell. The last building that was there was able to extend clear across the back edge of the triangle, almost into the road. And now it would have to be set back quite a bit on both sides. So, it's very difficult to market that. So let's take a look at Deubert's Corner. Back in the day, this was Deubert's Corner. You see the little triangle, and there's a little buggy, I guess, coming down south on Bellmore Avenue. And it is misspelled, scratched into this photo, which, by the way, when I was saying how diligent and lovely Historical Society members can be when noting the date on an article, a newspaper article, this is something that you see all the time. They scratch the information right on the surface of the photograph, which makes me crazy. Mm-hmm. And also misspelled Deubert, and that makes me nuts. So for all eternity, this is misspelled, but we're going to talk about that later. So this is at the turn of the century, and this house was owned by John G. Deubert, who was an important figure in local politics, first in Brooklyn and then in Nassau County. And he owned and operated a beautiful hotel right in the middle of town in Bellmore. And remember, this is where people went to do some fishing, some gaming, take in some country air. It's right in the middle of the town of Bellmore, and this 1906 map highlights this triangular plot of land that was his. And if I don't know how well you can read it, but you see J.G. Deubert right there, and that little tiny drawing is this home.
And I think sometimes if you can prove that there was something there originally, sometimes you can get a variance.
You mean with the setback?
With the setbacks, you can say, like, listen, this was here for forever, and there's no way it can be constructed, but we know how this is how it looked. And sometimes it might be worth a shot, and right. That might help you, getting things, getting things changed.
That's a good piece of advice. So then we have next, in the very early 1900s, the building became a restaurant or a lodge and was known as the Smithville Café. And later on, it was known as the Triangle Rest. So this postcard, according to the Smithsonian Institute's guideline, they have these guidelines for dating postcards. Because of the little border around it, we can tell that it dates from the early 1930s. Mm-hmm. Triangle Rest, we know it was called. Smithville Café, we know it was called. But the Rest Inn is something that we don't really know too much about. So in our collection, we happen to have, and this is something that it might have come from a clipping file or a vertical file at one point, but now we have it in archival folders, and we're trying to preserve it. This is a certificate of doing business, conducting business under the name of the Rest Inn, and it's dated from 1937. And then you can see here that Frank Canetti was the owner, and the business address, which I love, there are no details, just Bellmore Avenue and Bellmore Road, North Bellmore, Long Island. So it's the Rest Inn. And then lastly, we actually have a photograph of the Rest Inn with a car that looks like it's from the 1930s as well. So we have documented existence in our collection, and we have this one digital copy of a photo with unknown provenance. So it's really, it's interesting. I don't know why the Rest Inn wasn't covered. Perhaps it was only around for a couple of years. Mm-hmm. But after that, it became the Smithville Café again. And if you notice, you see how this restaurant runs all the way from one end of that triangle clear across to the other end. And it made, the proprietors made everything old new again. And after it was the Smithville Café in the 80s, it became Laura's Roadside Barbecue. And then, unfortunately, it became a barbecue itself of 2009. They believe it was arson. It just went up in flames. And the spot has remained vacant ever since the demolition of the building, which didn't happen until 2010. So now that sad little lot that you see. And just interestingly, on the next slide, we have the silhouettes of Deubert's Corner. That's the original picture. You see the house? Look at the rest in on the top right. You can see that the silhouette of the building is the same. You've got the postcard. It's the same structure, which I think is so interesting. And we use that in local history investigations, if you will, all the time. We look at the silhouette of a building to see if indeed that is the location that someone is asking about. Or, I lived a few houses down from such and such a restaurant or such and such a landmark. And then we can tell, yes, you're in the right area. So I love that you can see the silhouette of that.
And you can also tell that that road was actually made wider because there was actually more property.
Yeah.
First slide, yeah. So the roadway actually is probably like a very small roadway, and then they expanded it.
You're right. You're right. So this is something that I like to talk about. We've been talking about research, that librarians are terriers. Anytime a librarian acquires a new piece of information in the pursuit of answering a query, it becomes part of their physical and or digital collection to be used again in future research. So over the past 5-6 years, I've gathered this little group of documents, maps, and images for a single location in the hamlet of Bellmore. And if we're really good and we can manage to keep up to date, we scan or make digital copies of information, and we add what is known as metadata to the item so it can be found again and is useful. So when I say that we have documents that were maybe in a clippings file, now they're in archival folders, and we've got a big Excel spreadsheet which we're using as a database, and we have metadata, which is basically keyword information about that document. So if you want to find out if we have that document, it's pretty easy to locate where it is. We have the box number, the folder number, and the location of the box.
Yeah, we do the same too.
Right.
But one of the things we are trying to do with some of these old documents is we're trying to transcribe them, because what we found is a lot of young kids can't read cursive, and it becomes very difficult. So we try to have all that stuff transcribed. And sometimes it can be really difficult depending on the person's handwriting.
That is such an interesting project. And we actually have had 2 assignments given to us by a gentleman who had an ancestor who fought in the Revolutionary War. And there are documents that are part of the National Archives, and he has photocopies of them. Mm-hmm. Now they can be found on Ancestry.com. They've actually made their way onto Ancestry.com. But this soldier was asking for his soldier's pension. And it's a deposition that he underwent. And it took me months to translate it, and it was an absolute delight. It was so much fun. And we really had a good time reading through it together. So, I mean, local history research is fascinating.
Right. And you can just if you read this document here, County of Queens. So there you go. So,
there you go. Mm-hmm. And by the way, this is a draft. One of our famous people is Thomas D. Smith. So he was a justice of the peace in the town of Hempstead, for the town of Hempstead in the county of Queens. And he was also town supervisor. He was sort of a bigwig in the South Side Railroad. And then when it finally became the Long Island Railroad, he was a surveyor. He was a teacher. He was just sort of a Renaissance man. He had a law practice. And what you're looking at is we have a lot of drafts of his correspondence. And then they were transcribed and written beautifully by the clerk and put into documents that ultimately went to the county. So we have the rough drafts, and they're very interesting and very cool. So this letter reads, to Thomas D. Smith, a justice of the peace, blah, 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 under Section 61 of Article 4 of Title 1 of Chapter 16 of the Revised Statutes of the Amendments. Notice is hereby given thereto that the undersigned, a person liable to be assessed for highway labor in said town and residing therein, applies and asks for a jury to be drawn on the 2nd day of February 1880 to certify as to the necessity to lay out a highway in said town, commencing at the South Oyster Bay Turnpike Road, which I think is Merrick Road, opposite the southerly terminus of the Little Neck Road, now called Bellmore Avenue, and running from thence southerly through the lands of James M. Seaman to the creek, or landing, and from thence southerly and easterly to the south landing, which said highway will pass through the lands of James M. Seaman, who do not consent to the laying out of the same said road being of the width of 3 rods. So it's signed Joel Ackerley and dated January 26th of 1880. So this gentleman would like to have a big major road for the purposes of commerce run through his neighbor's land. And his neighbor's like, I don't think so. And this Seaman is his neighbor. So I never knew what happened with that request. So finally, I have access to a 1906 map where I see that I'm looking at the same area, and I notice that the requester, J. Ackley, is listed as a landowner below the proposed start of the road he wants, which makes sense because he wants to make sure that commerce runs right alongside his property. I see that his neighbor is, in 1906, is one Adam, or A.M.A., and that is a name I recognize. In a town literally named for the number of Smiths who lived there, M.A. is unusual enough to stick in my memory. Bellmore was called Smithville early on, and Thomas D. Smith is one of those famous Smiths. So thanks to the Hempstead Town historian, I actually have a copy of a map from 1935, which lists Harry M.A. as the owner of property right alongside Bellmore Canal, where his father had lived, next to J. Ackley. So the families were clearly involved. And if we look at that road, that is now known as Public Highway. You see Dock Road on the very bottom is known as Public Highway. And I remember we had a picture in our collection that referred to Bellmore Harbor as Public Highway. I see that that is Adam Amay's store. So now I go and I search Google Maps for that corner, and I find the Villa d'Aqua restaurant, which is the next picture. Okay. The Google Maps lists there, right there, Villa d'Aqua, and it's right along Bellmore Creek, and you'll see the shape is the same as on the old 1935 map. And the last picture here is of the Villa d'Aqua restaurant, which stands on the same spot and has kept the same profile of the building. Once again, we're looking at the silhouettes of the building, even after being rebuilt post Superstorm Sandy, which I think is really neat. And this is all pretty cool, and I never even had to leave my desk. So that's the kind of research that we get to do as local history librarians. The next thing you need to know, so we're Terriers. We never forget a question. It took me 5 or 6 years to finally get the answer, but it was important to me. You also need to know that librarians are hoarders. So in our collection, we have this wonderful picture of the Bellmore Boys Band, and they were pretty famous in the 20s. They used to play at public gatherings, at parades, just to entertain folks in public squares. And we also have a program from a concert from 1920, which is part of our collection. Now, why would we hold on to that? Is that important at all? It's kind of cute, it's kind of cool. But then I realized that people used to use the programs, if we go to the next slide, just like you would now in a yearbook, people would buy ads, and that is how you would finance it. Like, you could fundraise for an organization, you could fundraise for a school, people would buy ads, and local businesses would buy ads. So here is something else that I've been looking for. Your reliable tailor, Jay Lamanna. What's the address? We know his phone was Wantagh 524, and he was on Bedford Avenue, but I have no idea where that store was located. And I have been dying to know because I have a really neat photograph of Lamanna Tailors. That's Lamanna Tailor Dry Cleaner. This is sometime in the 40s. He's standing outside his store. And if you look really closely, his poor beleaguered wife is sitting in the window sewing. So he would keep her in the window, you know, peddling that sewing machine for everyone to see what a hardworking family they were. All right, so now we go to Ancestry.com. And it was very common for shopkeepers to live above their business. And that is precisely the situation with Lamanna Tailors. When I put in Joseph Lamanna, it's really hard to see here. It's very tiny. But I could see that he lived at, I believe it's 312. Yep, 312 Bedford Avenue. And he had his entire family. There's Rosa, the wife in the window. And that they were business owners and they were tailors. So I know now that the Lamanna Tailor Shop was at 312 Bedford Avenue, which helps me if I want to put together a map of where old businesses were. So that's kind of neat.
And sometimes it's a combination of looking at all different types of documents to
Right.
figure it out. So that's why kind of we save everything and we repurpose everything. So,
Yep.
because you never know, you just never know. Okay, so we both love our libraries. We love being librarians. And what we want you to know is that there are other libraries that you can join. Anybody living in New York State is eligible for library cards, city library cards. And you can apply for many of these cards online. Now, it's not that we're telling you to go to someone else, but what we want to tell you is that there's other resources. And you might as well get as many library cards as you can, because we all have different resources. So, there's nothing wrong with, having multiple library cards. We don't think you're cheating on us. So that's
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
No, in fact, we encourage it. This is an enormous privilege to have access to New York Public Library, Brooklyn and Queens Public Libraries. They have tremendous collections, and they're a huge system.
Right.
Huge systems. So, and we have access to that. Why wouldn't you?
Exactly. And just in Freeport, if you live in Freeport or you own property in Freeport, you work in Freeport, you're eligible for a library card there. And even your
Same
employees.
for Bellmore.
Yeah. So I always tell people, like, and people say to me, well, I have a card, like somebody from Bellmore might come to me and goes, well, my library card works, anywhere in Nassau County. I would like to place a reserve for one of your books, but I want to use my Bellmore card and pick up at Freeport. The problem is that Freeport patrons, people with our barcode, have priority. So what happens is people from our town keep jumping over you. So if you have a Freeport library card because you work in Freeport, you might as well get one, because you'll end up getting priority on our materials.
Right.
So I also want to talk about another incredible resource is the New York State Library. And when you go there, a lot of the databases they have will redirect you back to your public library. But if you are an attorney, a physician, or a municipal historian, you are eligible for something called a P card, which I believe stands for professional card.
Yep.
And so it's just another layer of databases that you can have access to. And again, you can apply for it online. Two of the databases that they have is something called New York's Historical Newspapers. And they go back to 1733. So it's just another newspaper database that you have access to. And something called the Digital Sanborn Maps, which I think you at Bellmore have access to, but just
for the moment.
For the moment, right. I actually have access to it through our historian, because she's a municipal historian, and therefore she has a P card. So if you're something you're looking for on a Sanborn map, and Sanborn maps are insurance maps. And at Freeport, we actually have the original 1917 Sanborn map. And the Freeport Historical Society has, I think, the earlier ones to that, which is interesting because those physical maps are actually in color, and the ones you have online are black and white. But if there's something you need from a Sanborn, you could always, if you're from Bellmore, contact Martha. Martha will contact me. I'll contact a village historian, because we're going to share all this stuff.
And that's true. I mean, we really do work together. We're very collegial, and we feel strongly about getting patrons, regardless of where they're from, information. And many of the librarians, we know one another, and we'll offer one another professional courtesy. And you are linked into a great network. Just start with your home library, and we will connect you.
Right.
Then we mentioned, I think, Regina, you mentioned the Long Island Studies Institute earlier. This collection is on the Hofstra campus, and it is open to the public by appointment. Of particular interest is the collection of the Nassau County Museum, which includes the very robust collection of the Nassau County Historical Society. So it is worth your while. If you have any interest in the history of your town, the history of Long Island, they also have something at Hofstra called the Suburban Studies collection. So they're looking at the development of Long Island as a suburb, and it's fascinating history. So it's definitely worth, calling up, making an appointment, and going over. It's a nice way to spend an afternoon.
Yeah, and I would always suggest making an appointment. Because I don't know if you have this, Martha, but I had a person come in on a Saturday, they drove 3 hours to Freeport because they're related to the Rayner family. And I'm thinking, like, you wouldn't call ahead to make sure somebody was there to help you? Because it just was like, no, always call ahead, make sure there is somebody there to help you. And in fact, that kind of might give them a chance to pull things for you.
That's exactly right.
Right, yeah. Okay.
So especially at smaller libraries like Bellmore, I mean, there are 2 local history librarians, but this is one small part of many other things we do. So we may not be available. We may not be in, like Regina said, or we may not be available at the moment when you walk in. So it's always a good idea to call ahead. And then we will prepare for your arrival.
Right, and what we try to do is try to make stuff as available to the public digitally.
Right, and we're working on that. That's an ongoing project. So these image databases, there used to be something called Long Island Memories, and it ultimately converted into the New York Heritage Digital Collection. And I believe it used to be a hub, right, of the Digital Public Library of America. Is it still?
I don't believe. I think they're not part of that.
Yeah.
But what happened, I think there's like, so this whole project is sponsored by the Long Island Library Resources Council, and I believe there's something like 9 councils in the state of New York.
Yes.
And they started it for Nassau, Suffolk, and they just kind of let us do that for a few years. And then all of these other library councils had been doing that locally, and the last few years, I think it was, they combined them all together. So this is everybody's images and yearbooks and other ephemera that people have digitized throughout New York State. So you have the ability to search across the entire state, or you can go into a specific collection.
Right. And it is tremendous. And when you search New York Heritage, obviously you're probably going to want to put in some, let's say you're from Bellmore, you're going to search Bellmore. There, you don't have to look at the Bellmore collection. Freeport's collection has postcards and images from Bellmore. Most of the South Shore, there's a lot of overlap. Mm-hmm. So kind of be loosey-goosey with your searching and cast a wide net, and I think you won't be disappointed. But this is a wonderful, wonderful website, and you can learn so much. We've actually had people call the library to say, I have a wonderful image that I think would enhance, and they'll give us the digital rights. So they'll send us a digital copy of the photograph. We'll do some research on it, and then we'll add it to our digital collection.
And I know what we do is when something is donated to us, like a digital copy, we always put your name in the metadata.
Oh, for sure.
So you will forever be attached to that image. So it's just a great way to share things, and you never know. Let's make it as widely available to the public as we can. So if you have some stuff, and even if you don't want to get rid of the originals, we'll just borrow your items for a little while. We'll digitize them and we'll send them right back to you.
Right.
And we get a lot of calls too from publishers and even TV producers who want to use images for documentaries or reproductions for books or magazines. So we get a lot of that too. So one of the interesting things about our image database is you can sort of search like through time and you learn a lot about what went on in your town and how certain things have changed and some things just stay the same. And here's an image of the hurricane of 1938. That's Casino, and that is the same angle of that picture from Hurricane Irene. And you can see in both cases the street flooded. So not much has changed there.
Okay, so looking in this same database, if you look at Bellmore, this is kind of interesting. The first image, this is the Bellmore Schoolhouse, which was built right around 1888, and it's now a private residence. So the dormers and the brick porch and the stairs were added after 1908 when the building was sold to private owners. The original entrance was on the west side. So if you look at the map, you'll see, oh, by the way, this was formerly the Stephen Baldwin estate. And you will see that the school is facing Newbridge Road, and that was a huge playground. So the original entrance was on the west side at the left of the picture, and that's showing a south side view. So the original structure was of wooden clapboard with its entrance facing Newbridge Road rather than Orange Street, and it comprised one large room featuring 7-foot windows. And the original slate chalkboard remains behind the east wall, while the school's wooden flagpole is presently located in the next house's yard and is used as a laundry pole. This is a landmark, by the way, one of the landmarks in the town of Hempstead. So on the 1906 map, you see that the property clearly lines up with Newbridge Road, but now the house is on Orange Street, about 3 houses in from Newbridge Road. And those other houses weren't there before. So the land that they were on was part of this huge playground, the lot that belonged to the school. So you'll see how development will change. You know, this address is now on Orange Street, but it was the Newbridge Road School. So, newspapers, local newspapers. Now, this is another, we talked about New York State, we talked about New York historical newspapers. This is a different source than the one that we had on the other slide, right?
Well, no, this is, the other one was a paid database. These are our local newspapers. And again, it's kind of like New York Heritage. It is all of New York State libraries are contributing to this project.
Right, and so, but they have similar names, but I don't want you to confuse them. But this is an amazing project, and I think I mentioned that we digitized our hometown paper, which was a labor of love and great expense and lots of time, and now we can be found on this amazing database. So it's exciting to see us there. Again, if I'm really looking for a piece of information, I never limit the search to just the Bellmore newspaper, because the town of Bellmore, going way, way back, was covered by papers in Freeport, in Brooklyn, at Rockville Center, Queens. The South Shore was kind of not fluid, but we kind of, maybe juicy events that were happening on the South Shore were picked up by Brooklyn and Queens newspapers. Mm-hmm. Announcements, all kinds of things.
And that's because, so many people from Brooklyn came out here and summered here. So you're definitely going to find, mention of them, and then you're going to find stuff in the Brooklyn papers about people out here on the South Shore.
Right. So cast a wide net, and it might. Yes, it takes a lot to go through these newspapers, but that's local history research, and genealogical research in general is very painstaking and meticulous. So,
right.
Stomach for it. This is a really good.
We started digitizing. I think we were the beta testers for Nassau County, or actually I think we were the beta testers for Long Island on this project. Mm-hmm. We started digitizing our newspapers in 2005, and that first we got a grant, and I believe that cost something like $24,000. This is not an inexpensive proposition. It is quite expensive, and it actually took us. So the first go round, we got a grant that got, I think, 9 rolls of newspapers digitized from 1895 to 1921. And we have been following up since then. And we finally finished this project, and it took us 15 years to get it all done. Wow. And every year we will do the previous year's worth of the local newspaper, The Leader. But it's so worth it. And I know Rockville Center just recently came online. Our papers went to 1921, and those were like the Nassau County Review, and that covered all of Nassau County. And then the newspaper moved to Rockville Center, and Rockville Center picked up on their microfilm from there on. And so, so all of a sudden that donut hole we had was been filled, and that was done in the last few years. So it's amazing how much more of these resources are available. And that's what I always say to people: keep checking back, because it's constantly being updated. And the one thing I love about the newspaper database is that in every article, it includes something called a persistent or durable link. So if you copy that link, it will always take you back to that one page. Right. So it's a really great asset.
Right. If you're keeping like a Word document and you're keeping all of the resources that you found, those permanent links are invaluable.
Yeah, exactly. And again, a couple of really cool things is that, checking out the newspaper ads. Like, so one of the things when I get people asking me for their house, I throw in the address, right? And so this person who lives at 166 Rutland just found out that they live in an old funeral home. Congratulations. That's why your house is haunted.
And it probably means it's a gorgeous house with ample parking. But anyway.
Exactly. The basement's a little creepy though. I don't know.
Yeah, just a little.
It's a little creepy. So anyway, so these are some of the things that you can find, and just you have to be a little creative with the way you search things, because sometimes they spell out words like road, sometimes they don't, sometimes they. So you got to be just kind of play around with it, and just always keep in mind that the names of streets have changed. So
Yes.
you keep that in mind. And here it is. This is an example of that same house just turned up in a newspaper that was not a Freeport newspaper. This is the East Rockaway Limbrook Observer. And now it seems like this house was a church. So it's a very interesting, you never know where you're going to find information. So as Martha said, just cast a very, very wide net.
I bet that's a really neat structure. Maybe we should take a field
I
trip.
know, maybe we should take a picture of it, right?
So then there's searching by name, which can also be tricky, especially with the older newspapers in the days before spell check. Remember, I already told you that Deubert was misspelled on the photograph. There was a lot of variation in spelling and or just plain old typos. So let's take Deubert again as an example. It's not a common name, so you think that you'll do fine. You just put it in, D-E-U-B-E-R-T, and there you go. I put Deubert in, and it's spelled several different ways in the same article. So be flexible. You'll find that in Ancestry.com too. When you search, you'll find that they actually allow you to search by almost exactly, is it exactly the spelling, or is it kind of like the spelling? Would it sound like it? It was like the Wild West in the old days. So you can also find individual mortgages extended to individuals, often by other wealthy landowners appear. So searching by a name of an individual reveals lots of activity and lots of different things. It's just very interesting.
Right. And what keep in mind too is that many of our newspapers that have been digitized were taken from microfilm. And
Yes.
for many, many years, those films were being run through a machine. So a lot of them are scratched. So when they run these microfilm through the computer to convert it to a digital file, they also convert all that text to make it machine readable. But sometimes if there's a scratch, it doesn't always pick up certain letters. And sometimes if they use weird fonts in a newspaper, the computer can't always read it. So definitely take your time with it. And even if the word is spelt right, the computer may not have realized the spelling has an incorrect spelling. And that is why those durable links are so important, because you might even have a copy of the article right in front of you, but you're putting in the title and it's not coming up. It's just because the way when it was converted, it's just not reading it properly.
But the neat thing too is that ads, the names do come up in ads, and that's really, really fantastic.
Yeah, you can get find a lot of great stuff.
Yep. All right, so we're going to share with you a couple of tricks of the trade. The first of which is, please look beyond page 1 of your Google results. There is some incredible stuff that can be found beyond the first 10 results. Maybe the top 3 are even sponsored. Books is actually wonderful. And I wanted to know who the proprietor of the Worth Hotel in Bellmore was, which we saw in the clippings file slide. So I wanted to know who the proprietor was at the turn of the century. So I tossed the terms Worth House and Bellmore into Google, and I found this lovely guide issued by the Long Island Railroad. And these were very common. They were trying to encourage travel to the country. So they would tell you things like how many miles it was from New York City, how many trains ran each day, and a couple of hotels in the area. So guess who? It was John G. Deubert's son, Edward. And I swear to you, I didn't know that before I did that Google search. Deubert, I must be haunted by Deubert. His son, Edward, was running the show, and John Deubert died, J.G. Deubert died at the Worth Hotel. So
Wow.
Kind of interesting.
Wow. Yeah, those are great. And I actually, some of the stuff I did in my collection was to go through Google Books and just try to put Freeport in, Freeport, New York, Freeport, Long Island, and see what books mention Freeport. And then I was able to go in and say, oh, okay, this is good to know. Like, or, should I purchase this book for our collection? So
Right.
there's some great stuff. you know.
Yeah, and there's a lot of like tax records. So
Yeah.
you can find out if you're unsure of the name of a hotel, like you're pretty sure that hotel was in your town, they have to they have to register. And so you would see, and so it's so funny because sometimes the addresses are like Bellmore, like no street. They're just
Right.
so well known, they won't give a street.
Exactly, because everybody knew. And just keep in mind, I know in Freeport we didn't start using uh, street address numbers until I think about 1908.
Oh yeah.
And that's when they started doing home delivery service. Until that time, you would go to the post office and pick up your mail. So so you'll find that a lot of things just say Fran Smith, Bellmore. Okay. And so
Right.
obviously the post office knew who she was, that they could figure that out. So, yeah. So just talk about Google searching can also bring up some of our digitized newspapers. And all of our newspapers that are in New York Heritage are Google searchable, and you will be able to get them. You'll get the actual articles. But there are other newspapers like the Brooklyn Daily Eagle that it's harder to get access to. So I'm going to give you an example. So this was about the Spite House. This was a house that was built on a property to keep another developer from splitting that property. So the house is always said to have been built in a day, and it wasn't. It was probably framed out in a day, and it kept this other developer from encroaching on another developer's property. So
That's
when you
amazing.
it's wild. And so if you do a search on the title, Spite House Must Come Down, the first hit you're going to get is something I wrote for our online encyclopedia. You go to that, woohoo! If you go to that encyclopedia, you're going to click the link to that article. You're going to be taken directly to this article. But if you were to click on number 2, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle site, you're going to be taken to a newspaper paywall. And this is because it's very, very frustrating. And people think that they know how to purchase the article. Newspapers.com is a vendor that will digitize your newspapers for free, but there's really nothing free in this world. And so what's going to happen is your newspapers are going to go into their database, and the Google searchable hits, and that's why a lot of people search, the Google searchable hits are going to direct you to that paywall. So but what we can tell you, and you can see here, these are the subscriptions. So it's not an inexpensive thing to join. I do have access to newspapers.com. So again, if there's something you're looking for, contact Martha if you're from Bellmore. She'll contact me. I'll get it for you. I'll hook you up. But you have to think kind of about who would have had these original newspapers. Like, so who would have, if I was the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, where would I be? Where would my microfilm collection be? Well, it's at the Brooklyn Public Library.
Yeah.
And if you go through the Brooklyn Public Library's website, and I have the URL there directly to the newspapers, you do not have to pay a cent for it. They can offer this to their patrons for free. Okay, so sometimes you got to think creatively on this one.
Right. And so then again, if you have, I mean, anybody can access this, but this is why it's such an advantage to be connected with the Brooklyn, the New York, and the Queens Public Libraries.
Right.
Always think about that. They're tremendous resources.
Right. And the same thing is said. So that we have the Brooklyn Public Library, and we can also go to the Brooklyn Historical Society. And this is a really cool location to be familiar with, because at one time it was known as the Long Island Historical Society. So they do have a lot of information that pertains to us here on Long Island. And they actually have newspapers going back. I think there's one newspaper, like the Long Island Farmer or something. It goes back to like 1809. So you can really get a lot of information about this area from very, very old newspapers.
So then there's historicmapworks.com, which is really neat. And you can search for your town or whatever section of the area you're looking for. And they have over 1.6 million searchable images in their collection. Now, when you bring it up, you will see that it is watermarked. So if you think you're being clever and you're going to do save image, it's going to have a watermark running through it. But you can purchase the digital image, and they're not that pricey. So if you're doing a project, or who knows, you want to make a wall dedicated to your street or your area, it's worth buying. And I think you can buy the digital. Do they also send you?
We can buy a digital copy of it, and you can actually get a physical copy, and they send you
Physical
it on,
copy,
yeah,
right.
you can get a physical copy, and they send it on some really nice very hard, like you have the option to get it on a nice thick paper,
Like
so,
parchmenty, yes.
right, so it's suitable for framing. So
Right, exactly. So if if you're of that bent, this is a really, really nice resource. But of course, you can look all you want for free, and sometimes it's just good for informational purposes. So
correct, yeah. So in a pinch, it's a good thing.
right.
Another place to look for historic maps is the archives at Queens Public Library. And they have a pretty extensive collection of Long Island maps, especially, as I mentioned, we were part of Queens County, so which makes sense. So here they have a bunch of Long Island maps going back to 1666.
Wow.
And they also have, you can see here, they have stuff by town. So there are a lot of maps that are for this area. Again, I would make an appointment, and it's in a special room. You go there, they send you to a certain elevator, and there's somebody there waiting for you. And yeah, they're awesome. They just have a lot of really great stuff. So a plug for them.
Is there a cavity search involved? It sounds like
No, there is not. But they will sit you at a table and they're watching you. You're not. Yeah, they're not. There's cameras everywhere, and that is because, and we know this like from our own collections.
right.
Some of this stuff is really valuable, and you don't want somebody like tearing out pictures or doing stuff like that. And they don't even want you to have bags on the table, and you just and just they won't even let you photocopy stuff. You have to have them do it for you. So
Right.
it's just their rules, and they're making sure that material will last generation after generation.
Right.
One of the other really, really cool things that New York Public Library has is a product called Map Warper. And this is a really, really expensive thing that they got. And hopefully someday we'll all have it. But the problem with old maps is that the orientation tends to be off on them, and the scale isn't right. So sometimes it's hard to figure out where things are located. And what Map Warper does is take these old maps, they change the orientation, and they change the scale so it matches a Google map, so they can lay the old map over a Google map so you can see where that street what is today, or that property. So it kind of gives you some perspective. And I know one of the early projects they did was they did a lot of European maps. And they said they did it because they had so many genealogy questions. And as you know, the boundaries of all these countries in Europe have shifted over the years. So your grandfather might have come here and his passport said he was Russian, but that really is part of Poland today. So
Yeah.
so it really helps you kind of figure out where the boundaries were.
Try and find Yugoslavia.
Exactly. So we at Freeport have a lot of the old maps, and one of my favorite is the Atlas of Long Island, which we affectionately refer to as a Beers map. And I don't know this to be true, but I am told that we're probably one of the last libraries that has an actual intact Beers map. A lot of these atlases got stolen because the prints sell, the different plates sell for a lot of money. So I do have it, and one of the things I have done is I've digitized it. So I'm making this all available for free on our website. So feel free, and we just have the other one locked up. And what is really cool about these maps is they show you who lived on these pieces of property, and they also show you some other features like that pond. And if you're familiar with Freeport, that pond is where the rec center is. And in a previous presentation, I told people, if there's ever a hurricane or a high tide warning, do not park your car in the parking lot of the rec center because it's on an old pond, and water has a tendency of coming back to where it was. You'll also notice on this map that you can see the center of the Freeport was really centered around Main Street. And so that was where it was mostly densely populated. There are also 2 cemeteries on this map. And when I go to a 1906 map, there's one cemetery. And as I mentioned before, that cemetery, the Smith Cemetery, got moved when the property was developed. And that cemetery at the top, which says Presbyterian Cemetery, it's not really a Presbyterian cemetery. It was the Freeport Cemetery. That got moved about 1920. And they built the first Freeport High School there. And today it is the playground for the middle school.
Wow.
So this is another, this is a Atlas of Long Island by E. Belcher Hyde. And this is 1914. And what I love about this map is there's a big red line going through what we know as Woodcleft. You probably know it better as the home of the nautical mile. And the line basically shows that anything below that red line is not the village of Freeport. It's in the unincorporated section of Freeport. And it sometimes makes us very difficult for us to search any residents or any structures below there because it wasn't part of Freeport. So none of these people living there or these businesses show up in any of our old directories. But later on, it does become part of Freeport. I mentioned before about not parking at the rec center parking lot. There are certain areas of Freeport that I have had people come to me who have said to me, I don't understand why my basement flooded. I don't know why in Hurricane Sandy, my house was really damaged. I don't live near the water. And I have to correct them and say, no, you live on the water because your house is built on an old lake. And this was the Crystal Lake, and you can see it there. It was quite, I think it was like 5 acres. It was quite a big lake. And today it's residential development. But the water is really still there. A few years back when they were repaving Guy Lombardo Avenue, the developer, the construction guy could not believe how much water he was finding along this road. And it was because there's an old stream there. So sometimes that comes back to haunt you. Another question I got was from a really nice patron who had just went to the buildings department in the village of Freeport. And he was told by a buildings department employee that he had a garage on his property. And that was news to the homeowner because he had lived in that house for 40 years and never had a garage. He wanted one, but he doesn't have one. So he asked me, is there a way to find out if there was ever a garage on his property? So using My Nassau Property, you can find information about a home. And it usually will tell you the date a house was built. So that was the first place I went. I wanted an idea of what maps I needed to look at. So going to My Nassau Property, I found the address, and it said that the home was built in 1910. Just a little word of advice. If you're using My Nassau Property, think of that date as a circa, because the dates are sometimes wrong. So just give it a sort of a time frame. So according to My Nassau Property, the house is built 1908. So the first map I had after that is 1910. And there is the patron's house. No garage, okay? But then in 1917, there is something there. There's a little structure there. 1928, there's a structure there. But as you can see, it is now moved. Not in place. By 1935, and this is a tax map we have for the village of Freeport, that structure is now in a different location. So I explained to the gentleman, whatever was on your property was not permanent. It actually seemed to migrate through your backyard. And I don't think a garage would be moving around. So he was very, very thankful for that. One of the wonderful gifts we have at the Freeport Historic Society are these old village tax maps. The village historian and I saved these from the dumpster. As a new administration came in, they were going to get thrown out because people are like, they're not relevant anymore, right? We're not using them. But as an archivist, they're perfect because they do tell you who lived in certain houses. And the great thing about these tax maps is somebody between 1915 and 1924, before the 25 came out, they went in and in red pen made updates and changes to the map. So we can sort of almost see the changes in Freeport in real time that somebody was creating.
Wow. So these are maps of the hamlet of Bellmore, and the weird thing about Bellmore is that the Freeport, the incorporated village of Freeport, and there is a layer of government in Freeport. So they have a town hall and these records. Bellmore is just part of the town of Hempstead. That's it. So we really don't have a local repository for these treasures. But we use the Beers maps and the Belcher Hyde atlases. And actually, I just wanted to once again talk about the collegiality. I did not have a digital image that was good of, actually I didn't have an intact page. I have one that's terribly torn from the Belcher Hyde map of 1906. So I called up my buddy Regina over at the Freeport Library, and she was able to send me a beautiful digital copy so that I could, and it's now part of my digital collection, and I can include it in presentations. So again, just a shout out. Librarians do like to work together, and we will go wherever we have to go to try, and we'll do our best to get you the information that you need.
We do our best. And I have to give a shout out to the guys down at our Department of Public Works. They have a big drum scanner. And though it's not ideal to run a map through it, sometimes it's the only thing we have. And so they were able to get a lot of these maps digitized. And now we do have an overhead planetary scanner that we have been scanning stuff with. And everything I scan, I do put online. So everything is, I'm trying to make things as accessible as possible.
Right, right. So librarians are terriers, hoarders, and notoriously cheap. So if it's free, it's for me. And this is a gorgeous map of Freeport, Merrick, Bellmore, Wantagh, and Massapequa from a 1914 Belcher Hyde atlas. And this is part of the digital map collection available through the New York Public Library. Now, what's amazing is now why on earth would I choose this map to look at Bellmore, right? Because it's covering so much. Take a look, they're vector files. So no matter how close up you get, if you go to the next image, yeah, I can blow this up and the clarity, the resolution isn't affected at all. So take a look, see the railroad tracks? Do you see this little yellow Clarendon Street right in the middle? That's where the Bellmore Memorial Library stands. So this is a teeny tiny piece of that map. And because it is a vector image and the New York Public Library has done such a fantastic job, it's extraordinarily useful. So this is a wonderful resource, New York Public Library.
Yes, and oh, well, actually, we have, somebody donated in 1914 this atlas to the Freeport Historical Society. And with our new planetary scanner that was generously donated to us with monies from Senator Brooks' office, we have been digitizing a lot of things, and we have digitized an entire atlas. I don't know if we have vector files, but we are making all this stuff available to the public for research purposes.
You know, and what we haven't really pointed out, I mean, we've mentioned it, but you know, the fact that you can see, for example, Regina asked me before, this is Frederick Park, apparently part of Bellmore back in 1914. It is no longer referred to that way, Bellmore Villas. But we also haven't mentioned that it was common practice to put the landowner's name, and that is so helpful when you're trying to reconstruct a family's history or the development of an area.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we found, one of the interesting things, Freeport had a lot of vaudevillians living here, and it's very interesting that a lot of the properties were in the wives' names. And I don't know why, but it was always in the wives' name, or a lot of them were. We mentioned that that we sometimes get calls from geologists, and they want to know what was on the property prior. And it's usually because they need to know if they need to do some sort of environmental cleanup or whatever. So I got a call about this property at 215 West Merrick Road, which was the Fulton Savings Banks. Most people refer to it as the Round Bank. Today it is a Taco Bell waiting to open. Oh. And the developer, they were buying the property, and they wanted to know like what else had been on that property. And using maps, which I could see that there was nothing on that property in 1930. And then by 1955, using a newsletter that was written and published by the Village of Freeport, that whole area did not get zoned commercial until 1955. And so the first known use of that land was this bank in 1962. And just a little side note here, when the bank opened, you got a 4% interest rate. So the bank was torn down and a fast food restaurant was put there, but I probably saved them some money because they didn't have to start doing soil samples because there wasn't like a munitions depot there or a dry cleaner or tannery. And we have a fascinating book at the library, at our library. It's called The History of Nassau County Community Place Names. And it's so interesting how no one knows like how sometimes their community got named. And one of my favorites is Roosevelt. Roosevelt was actually known as Rum Point. And it was named that way because it was on the stagecoach line, and there was a lot of taverns there. And at the time, the taverns were also hotels. So it had a reputation of having a lot of liquor.
So we have no idea why Bellmore is called Bellmore. It was originally known as Little Neck, and then it was known as New Bridge, and North Bellmore was known as Smithville South until 1920, and then we became Bellmore proper with the advent of the post office. And so this young lady was featured in a Newsday article. She has been doing a ton of research since she was a really young girl. So she's about 15, I think, here in this picture. And she is the youngest member that comes to our local history meetings and informational presentations. And she's hell-bent on finding out why Bellmore is called Bellmore. She has not given up. She was literally reading through thousands of pages of newspapers. And then when we digitized the Bellmore paper, it like opened up a whole world for her. So she really feels she is connected. Was a Lord Bellmore, but with one L, who lived in England. And apparently she thinks that there is some connection between Lord Bellmore and our town. I fully expect her to figure this out. But anyway, it's kind of interesting how meaningful this is.
Yeah, and it is fascinating, and you may never really uncover things, but what we find is we can maybe get kind of close to like this is the probability is this is why, and that's always
we have all kinds of urban legends. Like there's a legend that when the railroad would come through, the conductor's girlfriend lived here, and so he would ring the bell more for her. I mean, it's so heavy-handed, but that's what a lot of people think. So
I know. So, it is what it is. But yeah, no, it is fun trying to figure that all out. So we're going to end with something that happened to me a few years ago. And if you had seen another one of my presentations, I had gone into this, but I think it is worth repeating. So, as you know, Martha and I are reference librarians, and we have a lot of interesting people that come through our facilities.
Oh yeah.
And I remember just when we went on a lockdown, I remember everyone was telling me, you need to watch the Tiger King because you'll never believe these people. And I just looked at that whole cast of characters and thought, that's like Tuesday of me on the reference desk during a full moon. Right? I mean, all right, so you got Joe Exotic. I had a member of the Starfleet Academy ask me a question once.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'm not really surprised. So one day a woman comes into the library and she's telling me that she's got a speakeasy in her basement. And I just smile because I'm not gonna like go there. Like, okay, really? And so she's insisting that I come to her house and see it. And I'm like, I should go with a complete stranger to her house in Northeast Freeport and then go down to her basement because nothing bad could happen there. So she's very, very insistent. So I bring some reserves. I bring the director of the library and Cynthia Krieg, our village historian, to this woman's house. And the story is that her aunt bought the house in, I think, the 1960s and had lived there until her death. And her nieces inherited the house. And they were selling the house and it needed some reno. It needed some upgrades. So they had a lot of workmen come in. And one of the workmen was like, ladies, there's something behind this wall. And they're like, no, there's nothing there. And he goes, no, this closet, it doesn't make any sense. And he found like this like trigger and he pops it and it all opens up. The whole wall swung out. And in it is a full-on bar. And we found newspaper clippings in there that were about 1937. So we don't think the bar it was closed off once the owner had died, and nobody afterwards ever knew it existed. And you walk through it, and had been beautifully appointed. It actually, these tile floors with it said, FZPAO, which we believe was the homeowner, Frederick Zeimer, proprietor and owner.
Oh,
This part of Freeport was part of Roosevelt during Prohibition, and Prohibition was from 1920 to 1933. And these are the band for the Roosevelt fire department. And so he was a member of the fire department. And you can see there are all these liquor bottles with liquor in them. The back is full of bottles.
oh, it's incredible.
It's crazy, absolutely crazy. And we were able to get the still. They donated the still to the Freeport Historical Society, a beautiful copper still. And over here is where they would have filled the bottles, and there would have been a bucket there, so nothing would have been wasted. So this concludes our program, and I just want to we just want to share some resources with you. So again, here is the free newspaper access, and free access to our digital photos. And I also have put together a local history guide. It's predominantly for Freeport, but I do, as I mentioned, I have a lot of maps from different communities that I have loaded up.
I've definitely found resources and information on other areas, no question.
Yeah. And so these are all the free sources. And what I would suggest you guys do is, if you're doing any research, if you don't find anything right away, come back in a few months, because things just keep getting loaded and loaded. Martha put together a house history resource page, and I have it here. This is the URL that will take you to that handout. So it includes all the URLs. And
right, everything we discussed.
Exactly. And just so you know, this program and other history programs you can find on our random programs you can find on our YouTube channels, and these are URLs that will take you to them. Before we conclude, Martha, do you have any let me just say this. Here's our contact information, all right?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so if you contact me, I will give you Martha's home phone number, and you never call her in the middle of the night, because she's very good at that. Yeah,
I love doing local history research from my bed. Yes, absolutely.
Exactly. And if you contact Martha, she'll give you the password combination to my garage. Feel free to come over and use my tools. Seriously though, feel free to contact us, and we'll definitely try to help you do some of your research. So before we go, Martha, do you have any shameless plugs? Anything you want?
Shameless plugs? Yes, on our YouTube page, you will find we were part of the StoryCorps at Your Library program, and there's a lot of really interesting oral histories that you can access, plus some very brand new staff-created content. People who are now quarantined at home are recording stuff right and left, and it's really surprisingly good. So please do check out our YouTube channel.
Yeah, and I will shamelessly plug. I have a couple of programs up. I have one about one is called Freeport Walks into a Bar, and it's the history of bar culture in Freeport. And the other one is I Don't Know Much About Freeport. And coming soon, I should be doing one on the history of Bennington Park, which is a community in Freeport. It's no longer there. It's now where Home Depot is, but it became a African American and Italian enclave, and it has such an amazing, rich history. And the people that live there are also proud of that community. And so I can't wait to get that program up. And the other one I would like to do is what I have, I'm just reworking it, is the Jews of Freeport, which is the history of Jewish culture in Freeport. And that came out of a program I had done for a local Hadassah here. And it's very interesting. And I'm just in the process of updating it, because I actually found even more information to add. So keep looking out for those. And again, feel free to contact us. Thank you guys. Thanks for everything.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I don't know how to stop the recording.